Single dad took a knife for a schoolgirl next morning. Her politician mom knocked on his door. A storm-slick city, a dented car. A father 3 months behind on rent watches a blade glitter under a school's awning and makes a choice that could leave his boy without a dad. This isn't about fearlessness. It's about what a man does with fear when a child stands in the way. Sirens too far. A bus bearing down. A stranger's scream tangled with a son's dad. Keep going. Follow this story to the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far this story has traveled, whose windows this rain taps against tonight. Tell me where you're watching from now. The rain came down in cold ropes, stitching the Seattle evening together with needles of silver and sound. Headlights smeared across wet asphalt. Brake lights blinked like wounded eyes. Inside a 15-year-old Honda, the defroster wheezed and fought the fog on the windshield, losing by inches. Ethan Reyes checked the dashboard clock and winced. 20 minutes late again. Jefferson Elementary would have been empty by now if not for the covered entrance where stragglers huddled under fluorescent hum. He pulled to the curb. Under the awning stood his 8-year-old Lucas Star Wars jacket zipped to his chin backpack too big for his narrow shoulders. When Lucas saw the familiar dent in the Honda's front fender, his face brightened, then gentled into that brave grown-up look Ethan hated to see on a child. "Sorry, buddy," Ethan said as Lucas climbed in, flinging raindrops everywhere. "Mr. Dalrymple dumped a transmission on me at 4:30. Said it couldn't wait." "It's okay, Dad," Lucas answered, voice small, steady. He clicked his seatbelt. "Mrs. Garcia let me help clean the white boards. She gave me an extra sticker." The heater rattled louder. Ethan adjusted the rearview mirror and really looked at his son's dark eyes how much of his mother lived there. 3 years since the hospital and the long goodbye. 3 years since he'd learned how quiet a house could be. He wanted to remember Lisa laughing off-key on Sunday mornings, flour on her cheek. He wanted Lucas to remember, too. "How was school?" Ethan asked, easing the car into the thin river of traffic. "Fractions." "I'm good at them," Lucas said. "A beat." "Tommy's dad's taking him camping. In the mountains." Ethan's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Mountains, tents, hot dogs on sticks. The kind of normal he kept promising and kept not delivering. Maybe next month. Maybe when the shop slowed down. Maybe when the rent caught up. Maybe when the inhaler refill didn't cost more than groceries. "That sounds nice," Ethan said. "We'll plan something, you and me." Even as he said it, they both knew how promises could sit on a shelf and collect dust. The light turned red on Maple Street. Rain battered the roof like 1,000 fingers drumming impatience. To their right, floodlights threw hard white onto Roosevelt Middle School's brick facade 2 blocks ahead. People were moving strangely, clusters gathering and recoiling like water striders when a stone breaks the surface. "What's happening?" Lucas pressed his face to the cold window. "I don't know," Ethan said. The light flipped green, but nothing moved. Far up the line, a ripple of horns. The scene resolved in jagged pieces as the Honda inched forward. A man in a dark hoodie backing toward the street, something bright and wrong in his hand. A girl in a plaid skirt frozen in front of him, blonde hair soaked flat against her head. The rain seemed to bend around them the way sound bends around a scream. Ethan's body went cold, then hot. "Lock your door," he said. His voice came out calm like someone else's. "Lucas, look at me." Lucas looked up. There was fear there, but trust too, the kind that breaks a man if he betrays it. "Lock your door. Don't get out for anyone but me or a police officer. Dad. Promise." Lucas's thumb slammed the lock. Click. Ethan slid the shifter into park and stepped into the rain. It hit him like an accusation. Oil-stained work shirt plastered to his back, boots slipping. He could hear Lucas calling his name through glass and weather, and distance a thin wire tugging at the center of him. The sidewalk seethed with people keeping their distance. A crossing guard. 2 teachers. A delivery driver with a phone held up like a shield. On the curb, a patrol car idled, the officer still ducking into his radio, trying to make order out of a bad thing. "Stay back!" The man in the hoodie shouted, jerking the girl closer. The knife flashed in the street lamp, a kitchen blade broad and cheap. Ethan put up his hands, palms empty. He moved slow. He had seen Desperate before at the shop when a father begged for a brake job he couldn't pay for at the pharmacy. When the pharmacist shook his head at the price of an inhaler, Desperate had a smell. It had a temperature. It had this man's wild, not-here eyes. "It's okay," Ethan said, breath thin from the cold. "No one wants trouble." "Don't lie to me," the man barked. Rain ran off the brim of his hood. "Everyone wants something." The girl looked 11, maybe. Her backpack was a statement more than a bag designer leather gold zipper. Her knees knocked under the skirt. She tried to be still and brave and small all at once and failed at all three because she was a child. "Hey," Ethan said softer now, as much to the girl as to the man. "You're all right. You hear me." Her wide blue eyes lashed to him like a lifeline. Behind him, sirens started up, a distant whale swimming closer. The crowd murmured. Ethan's heart kept double time. Every instinct screamed to charge. Every other instinct screamed to think. The man's arm twitched, moving the blade closer. "I said back off. I'm backing off," Ethan lied, taking one more step forward. Wet concrete gritted under his boots. He could count the raindrops on the knife blade. He could see the fine tremor in the man's wrist, the tremor that said he didn't want to be this person, and yet here he was. "What's your name?" Ethan asked. "Doesn't matter. It matters to me." Another step. His shoulder brushed a parking meter. A bus engine rumbled at the intersection, bearing down with the kind of momentum that doesn't care about human stories. The officer finally climbed out of his car, hand held out, voice rehearsed. "Sir, put the knife down." "Don't you tell me," the man snapped, and in the snap the girl flinched toward the street, a reflex to recoil from the sound. Her heels skidded off the curb, her body pinwheeled 1 inch too far. The bus's windshield yawned like a moving wall, a black mirror swallowing rain. Time went elastic, sound tunneled. Ethan saw everything at once, Lucas's reflection in the side mirror fogging the glass with his breath. The scar on his own knuckle from the day he slipped with a socket wrench because his hands were shaking after a call from the collections office. The way Lisa used to touch his shoulder when he spoke too quickly, grounding him with just a palm. Ethan did not calculate. He did not weigh outcomes. He moved. He lunged toward the girl. The man's reaction was a bright streak steel whistling in wet air. Ethan felt the edge bite through fabric and into meat just below his ribs, a hot, exact pain that made the world white at the edges. He got his hands on the girl's shoulders and wrenched her sideways, twisting his body between her and the knife between her and the street. "Run," he gasped, voice torn, breath gone. "Police, go!" She stumbled toward the officer's shoes, skidding, sob tearing out of her. The bus's brakes screamed as it passed, wind billowing their clothes, rain jumping from the road in sheets. The man came again, desperate, louder now. The second slice found Ethan's shoulder, a burning line that stole his left arm for a heartbeat. His knees hit the concrete. Cold shot through him like a second blade. Somewhere, someone shouted. Somewhere, a door slammed. Somewhere, a boy yelled "Dad" with a panic that rewired the universe. Ethan planted one hand and pushed up, not to stand. There was no standing, but to put himself between the man and where the girl had been. He was a bad wall, but a wall anyway. "Drop the weapon." The command cracked through the rain. Boots pounded. A baton clattered free of a belt. Radios hissed. The man's eyes flicked from Ethan to the blur of uniforms, to the wet knife in his hand, to a future he couldn't bear. He took one half step like a man on the edge of a roof trying to remember which way is down. Ethan tasted iron. He tasted rain. He thought of the inhaler Lucas kept in a zippered lunch bag because he was embarrassed to show other kids. He thought of the past due notice folded into his wallet like a curse. He thought of a girl's life that should go on without this night staining everything after it. He did not think of heroism. He thought of being a father and how that job sometimes includes protecting someone else's child because that is what you hope another father would do for yours. He shifted his weight. He met the man's eyes and said quietly, "Don't." For a heartbeat, the rain seemed to pause between sky and earth. Then the knife flashed again. The blade's arc caught him high across the shoulder, ripping through soaked cotton and into muscle. Ethan's breath burst out of him in a soundless cry. His knees buckled. The wet concrete met him hard, the cold a second shockwave. "Dad." The scream broke out of Lucas, muffled by glass and rain, but sharp enough to spear Ethan's heart. The girl, small, trembling, her blonde hair slicked to her cheeks, bolted past Ethan's crouched frame. She lunged toward the officer, waving her forward, sneakers splashing in a puddle, sobbing. Ethan twisted his head just enough to see her collapse behind the shield of navy blue uniform. She was safe. That was the only measure that mattered. But the manhood pulled, low desperation pouring off him like heat, still stood above Ethan's knife, dripping rain and blood together, knuckles white around the handle. "Stay back." His voice cracked under its own weight. "I can't go to prison. My kid's waiting. He's hungry. He needs me." Ethan's good hand pressed to his side, feeling warmth spill between his fingers. Pain flared and dimmed in pulses, leaving the edges of the world blurred. Yet his eyes stayed locked on the man, not the weapon. "Then think of him," Ethan rasped, his throat burned with rainwater and copper. "Think of your boy. He doesn't need this. He doesn't need you in a cell. He needs you alive." The man faltered, chest-heaving hoodie plastered tight to him. For the first time, Ethan saw the wet glimmer of tears mixing with rain on his cheeks. Behind them, sirens stacked one on another, growing louder, closer. Boots slapped pavement. Voices barked orders. The world was closing in fast. "Drop it!" The nearest officer's shout was a wall of authority. "Drop the knife now." The man jerked sideways as if the words were another blow. His grip tightened, then trembled. His gaze flicked down at Ethan, blood blooming dark across the mechanic's shirt. You said you understand." Ethan's head swam. He wanted to collapse, to shut his eyes against the cold street and the pain sawing through his side, but he forced himself upright on one elbow. He owed this moment to the girl, to Lucas, to the man who still had a choice. "I do," Ethan croaked. Bills stacked high. Nights staring at the ceiling, wondering how you'll feed him tomorrow. The shame when your kid asks for something small and you can't give it. "I know." The man's breath shuddered out. His arm lowered an inch. "Then you know it doesn't stop. You know it just keeps grinding. I tried everything. Lines at the food bank, applications, calls that never get returned. They don't care about us." His voice broke wild and raw. "People like her." He pointed a shaking blade toward the girl, now shielded behind officers. "They'll never know what it's like." Ethan's chest seized at the truth in it, the sting of recognition. He thought of Lucas coughing through nights they couldn't afford another inhaler. He thought of the second job that never quite covered the gap. He thought of the way parents in newer cars barely noticed him at pickup. "You're right," Ethan whispered. "They don't know. But she's not the reason. She's just a kid. She doesn't deserve the weight of your pain." For a moment, for the length of a held breath, the world balanced on that knife edge, rain, pattering sirens, keening headlights, crawling across slick pavement. The man's eyes locked on Ethan's. There was a plea in them, a drowning man's last scan for rope. Then the thunder of police filled the street. More cruisers screeched to a stop. Doors slamming, weapons drawn. The fragile thread snapped. The man jolted, eyes wide with panic. "They'll take me," he muttered. "They'll take me away." No, Ethan forced out every syllable, dragging blood with it. "They'll help, if you let them." But the man's gaze darted everywhere, police crowd flashing lights, the girl crying in an officer's arms. His knuckles whitened. The knife wavered like a compass needle that couldn't find north. Then in a single shuddering exhale, he sagged. The steel clattered to the ground, clinking once, twice against the wet sidewalk. The officer surged forward. Hands grabbed his arms, twisted them behind his back, pulled him to his knees. The fight seemed to leave him before they even touched him. His head dropped forward. His words were lost under the rain. Ethan's own strength left with the sound of that knife hitting pavement. His elbows slid out from under him. The ground rose and claimed him. Lucas's face, pale frantic, filled the blurred circle of his vision. The boy must have escaped the locked car, must have fought through the sea of legs and shouting voices. Now he was kneeling on the wet street, small hands pressing desperately at his father's side. "Dad, you're bleeding! You're bleeding!" Lucas's voice broke apart. "Don't close your eyes. I'm okay," Ethan lied. Though darkness was already creeping at the edges, curling inward, blue light strobed against rain, radios buzzed. Someone shouted for paramedics. Boots splashed closer. But all Ethan could see was his son's eyes, fearful, fierce, unblinking. He reached up with a trembling hand smeared with his own blood and cupped the boy's cheek. "You're safe," he whispered, even though Lucas wasn't the one who had been in danger. Then the world tilted sideways, rain streaking across the night sky like falling stars. And the last thing he heard was Lucas crying his name as everything went black. The world returned in pieces, beeps, first steady and insistent, then light, too white, too sharp, burning against his eyelids. Ethan tried to move, and a wall of pain pressed him down hot and heavy. His ribs screamed. His shoulder throbbed with every shallow breath. He forced his eyes open. The ceiling above him was bland, painted the same antiseptic shade he remembered from another hospital room years ago when Lisa had lain pale and wasted beneath too many wires. The memory crashed into him with such force he almost gagged. "Dad." The voice was small, frayed. He turned his head, wincing. There in a chair pulled so close his knees nearly touched the bed sat Lucas. His Star Wars jacket was still zipped, but now wrinkled, stained at the cuffs. His hair was messy, his eyes rimmed red. "Hey, buddy." Ethan's voice scraped out like gravel. How long was I out?" "All night," Lucas whispered. His hands clutched the plastic arms of the chair like if he let go, Ethan would drift away. The doctor said, "You lost a lot of blood, but you're going to be okay." Ethan swallowed. His throat tasted of copper and medicine. He reached for his son, but his arm trembled too much, wrapped in gauze and tethered to tubes. "Come here." Lucas stood, climbed carefully onto the edge of the bed, and curled against his uninjured side. Ethan closed his eyes, breathing in the smell of rain, still clinging to his boy's jacket. A soft voice cut through the steady beep. "Mr. Reyes." Ethan looked over to see Mrs. Garcia, Lucas's teacher, sitting in the corner, her hands folded tight in her lap. Her kind face looked older in this light lines carved deeper by worry. "Thank God you're awake," she said. Lucas refused to leave. "I stayed the night too." Ethan's chest tightened. "You didn't have to?" "Yes, I did." Her tone was gentle but firm. "We take care of each other. You've been carrying too much alone." His gaze dropped. Carrying too much. Always too much. Rent medication, empty fridge grief he never allowed himself to say out loud. The girl, he asked suddenly, panic tightening his chest. "Is she—" "She's fine," Mrs. Garcia said quickly. Relief washed through her features. "Thanks to you, she wasn't hurt. It's all over the news. They're calling you a hero." Hero. The word landed wrong, heavy and jagged. He didn't feel like a hero lying here, dripping, barely able to lift his head. He felt like a fool who'd almost left his son an orphan. "I'm sorry, Lucas," he whispered, turning his face toward his boy. "I'm so sorry I scared you." Lucas shook his head fiercely, pressing closer. "You saved her dad. You saved that girl." Ethan wanted to believe that made it worth it, but guilt gnawed at him. Lisa's voice whispered in memory, "Don't leave him alone in this world." A knock at the door startled him. A woman entered, tall blonde tailored suit hanging sharp on her shoulders despite the early hour. She moved with the kind of poise people recognized from television screens and campaign posters. Behind her trailed the girl, smaller, now no school uniform, just jeans and a sweatshirt. The backpack was gone. Her eyes, the same blue from last night, flicked shyly toward Ethan. Ethan knew the woman instantly. Caroline Whitmore, city councilwoman, face plastered on every bus stop during election season. Known for education reform speeches for promises about working families. He'd always assumed it was just rhetoric. "Mr. Reyes," she said, voice softer than in her interviews. "I'm Caroline Whitmore. This is my daughter Sophie." The girl stepped closer. Up close, Ethan saw her resemblance to her mother, the jawline, the determined eyes, but right now she looked exactly what she was, a frightened child trying to be brave. "Thank you," Sophie whispered, her voice barely carrying. You saved my life." Ethan fumbled, suddenly aware of his rumpled gown, his oil-stained hands now wrapped in gauze. He tried to sit straighter against the pillows. "You don't need to thank me," I just, anyone would have, no. Caroline shook her head firm but trembling at the edges. Not everyone would have. Most people would have stayed in their cars, called 911, waited. You put yourself between my daughter and a knife. The weight of her words filled the room, pressing into the silence until Lucas shifted uneasily beside him. Mrs. Garcia cleared her throat. Maybe I should take Lucas to the cafeteria for breakfast. Lucas looked up, hesitant. Can I stay with Dad? Ethan stroked his hair weakly. Go on, buddy. I'll be here when you get back. Reluctantly, Lucas slid off the bed and left with Mrs. Garcia. The door closed. The room shrank to three, the wounded mechanic, the politician, and her daughter. Caroline stepped closer to the bed. Ethan noticed how carefully she held herself, every line of her posture taut, as if holding together something that wanted to unravel. Mr. Reyes, Ethan. She began, her eyes wet, though her voice stayed steady. When I got the call that Sophie had been in danger, I felt helpless. All my connections, all my influence, none of it mattered when it counted. But you mattered, a stranger, a man who had every reason to drive away, bled for my daughter. Do you understand how rare that is? Ethan shook his head weakly. I have a son. I know what it's like. I couldn't just watch. That's exactly why it matters. Caroline said, her composure cracking just enough to show the mother beneath the councilwoman. You had every reason to put your own child first. Instead, you chose to save mine. Sophie stepped forward, eyes earnest. Mom says, you got hurt really bad because of me, that you could have died. Ethan's throat tightened. I could have, but I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try. Her small chin lifted. That makes you brave. A weak laugh escaped him. Or very stupid. No, Sophie insisted. Mom says bravery is doing the right thing even when you're scared. Caroline blinked at her daughter as if seeing her wisdom for the first time. She looked back at Ethan. She's right, and what you did was the definition of brave. The monitor beeped steady as rain against glass. Ethan closed his eyes. He wasn't sure which hurt more, his wounds or the truth in their words. The door clicked softly shut behind Mrs. Garcia and Lucas, leaving the room stripped of its comforting noise. Only the steady beep of the heart monitor remained underscored by the hushed rain that still battered against the hospital's narrow windows. Caroline Whitmore drew closer to the bed, her heels muted against the tile. Up close, Ethan could see the faint smudge of exhaustion under her eyes, the hair that had frizzed just enough at the ends to betray that she hadn't slept. Whatever polish she wore on television had cracked here. What stood in front of him wasn't the councilwoman, but a mother who had nearly lost everything. Sophie lingered near the foot of the bed, shifting from one sneaker to the other. Her eyes stayed fixed on Ethan, wide and luminous, a child trying to measure the weight of gratitude she didn't yet have words for. I need you to hear this, Caroline said. Her voice had the low edge of steel wrapped in velvet. Yesterday, I thought my daughter would never come home to me. And then a stranger, a man with nothing binding him to her, threw himself into the path of a knife. Her throat bobbed once. That's not something I can let pass with a thank you. Ethan opened his mouth, but she lifted a hand. Please, don't tell me anyone would have done it, because I've spent years watching how people behave when it's hard. Most people look away. They keep driving. You didn't. Her intensity pinned him harder than the IVs and bandages. He shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware of how small he looked under the sterile sheets of the old scars on his knuckles and the faint smell of motor oil that never seemed to leave his skin. I don't need charity, he said finally, voice rough. Lucas and I, we get by. Caroline's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't argue. Instead, she reached into her leather bag and laid a card on the bedside table. The weight of it, embossed official, seemed absurd in this room that smelled of bleach and iron. I spoke with your boss, she said. You'll have paid medical leave for as long as recovery takes. Your job is safe. Ethan blinked. You didn't have to do that. There's more. Her voice shifted into the cadence of someone used to delivering policy, but beneath it was something far more personal. I'm a board member for a health foundation. They'll cover Lucas's asthma treatments. All of them. Inhalers, specialist emergencies, whatever he needs. Ethan's jaw worked, but no sound came. Relief struck him like another wound stealing breath, leaving only ache. No more choosing between power bills and medication. No more sleepless nights running numbers that never added up. Why? His whisper was barely audible. Caroline looked at Sophie, then back at him. Her eyes were wet, unblinking. Because I can't repay what you did for my daughter, but I can make sure the boy who almost lost his father never goes without. Silence stretched, filled only by the monitor's rhythm. Ethan wanted to protest, to cling to dignity, but the image of Lucas wheezing in the night anchored him. At last he swallowed hard. I don't know how to thank you. You don't need to, Caroline said. You've already done more than anyone could ask. For the first time since entering, Sophie edged closer, her sneakers squeaking faintly. She looked at Ethan with solemn sincerity. Mom says you're a hero. I think you're more than that. Ethan managed a faint smile despite the weight in his chest. What's more than a hero? Her answer came soft, steady. A dad who's brave for everyone. The words hit him deeper than the knife had. His throat thickened, eyes burning. A knock broke the fragile stillness. A nurse leaned in, brisk, efficient. We'll need to change his dressings in a few minutes. Caroline nodded, then bent slightly toward Ethan. Rest, heal, we'll talk again. She touched Sophie's shoulder, guiding her toward the door. The girl turned once more, gave Ethan a shy wave, and disappeared into the hallway's hum. When the door closed, Ethan sagged back against the pillows. The card gleamed under the fluorescent light, a symbol heavier than any coin. He stared at it until the nurse moved in, adjusting tubes, checking wounds. Pain throbbed through him, but beneath it stirred something else, an unfamiliar weight of being seen, of being recognized, not as a mechanic scraping by, but as a man whose sacrifice had mattered. Still, as the nurse worked, guilt gnawed. What if the knife had gone deeper? What if Lucas had been left alone in this world? He closed his eyes, hearing again Sophie's words. A dad who's brave for everyone. The thought both steadied and broke him. The hospital lights had always unnerved Ethan, the fluorescent hum, the sharp scent of antiseptic that clung to his clothes like guilt. He'd been stitched up, bandaged, and lectured by 3 different doctors, but none of it stuck. What stayed was the face of Lucas pressed against his hospital bed, eyes wet but trying to look strong. Caroline stood on the other side of the room, a storm bottled behind her polished exterior. She hadn't left Sophie's side since the ambulance. Now Sophie lay curled in a chair, small and pale, watching Ethan as though afraid he might vanish if she blinked. Why Caroline's voice finally broke the silence. Not loud, but cutting. Why would you step in front of her? You don't even know her. Ethan shifted his ribs, protesting. He looked at Sophie. First, then Caroline. Because she's a child. Because no one else did. Her breath hitched, caught between relief and something harder. Anger, gratitude, disbelief tangled like wires. You nearly died. Better me than her, Ethan said, voice flat. He had no heroism left in his tone, only exhaustion. Lucas squeezed his hand, small fingers warm. Dad, don't say that. Ethan softened, brushing his thumb over Lucas's knuckles. I'm here, buddy. That's what matters. The nurse entered, checking vitals, murmuring instructions, but the tension between Caroline and Ethan stayed thicker than the IV tubes coiled at his bedside. Later that night, when Lucas had dozed off with his head on Ethan's blanket, Caroline lingered. She held a paper cup of lukewarm coffee untouched. I've spent my life writing laws, she said quietly, building protections on paper. But it was a stranger's body that shielded my daughter. Ethan closed his eyes, letting the words settle. He didn't want praise. He didn't know what to do with it. Don't put me on a pedestal. I'm just a mechanic who made a choice. Mechanics don't usually get stabbed for councilwoman's daughters. She said, her tone a mix of dry humor and awe. Guess I'm a lousy example of my profession, Ethan murmured. Caroline's laugh cracked under the weight of the day. She pressed her palm against her forehead. You're impossible. No, Ethan said softly, opening his eyes again. I'm just a dad. That's all. She studied him, then really studied the scar forming already along his shoulder, the hollow under his cheekbones, the resilience woven into him. For the first time in years, Caroline Whitmore, who'd debated senators and out-talked billionaires, found herself speechless. Morning bled through blinds, and with it came headlines. Single father shields child from attack at Roosevelt Middle. Reporters camped outside the hospital doors, hungry for details. Caroline's staff rushed in with statements urging discretion, but Caroline waved them off. Not yet. This isn't about politics. Not today. She walked into Ethan's room, phone buzzing nonstop in her pocket. There's press waiting. They know your name. Ethan's head turned sharply. My name. No, I don't want... You saved my daughter, she said firmly. They'll write something whether you speak or not. Better it come from truth than speculation. Ethan exhaled frustration, clawing his chest. He had never asked for attention, only survival for him and Lucas. Truth. The truth is, I'm nobody. A single dad barely paying rent, a guy who happened to be standing there. Caroline leaned closer, her eyes narrowing with resolve. That's exactly why it matters. Because you're not famous, not rich, not untouchable. You're ordinary. And ordinary people need to see that courage doesn't belong to the powerful alone. Her words lodged deep where resistance met recognition. Lucas stirred awake, looking between them. Dad, maybe? Maybe it's good people know. Maybe someone else will be brave next time. Ethan's throat tightened. Out of the mouths of children, truth so simple it left no place to hide. He gave Caroline a long look. If we do this, it's on my terms. She nodded without hesitation. Then tell me what they are. By the time Ethan faced the cameras, the bandages were fresh, his shirt collar stiff against them. He stood outside the hospital, Lucas by his side, Sophie gripping her mother's hand. Reporters shouted questions, mics shoved forward. Ethan raised a hand, silencing the chaos. I'm not a hero, he said into the lenses. I'm a father. I saw a little girl in danger and I did what I hope anyone would do. His gaze drifted to Lucas, then Sophie, but maybe that's the problem. We shouldn't have to hope. We should know our community will protect its children, not out of duty, out of love. Caroline placed her hand lightly on his arm, support, not possession. Cameras clicked like rain on tin roofs, and in that frozen frame something shifted. It wasn't just a story about violence averted. It was the beginning of a narrative bigger than all of them. A narrative that would soon circle back to Ethan's door carrying weight he never expected. The ripple began before Ethan even made it back home. By the time he left the hospital with Lucas carrying his overnight bag and Caroline insisting on a private car, the city already buzzed. His face, captured by one reporter in grainy light, had spread across news feeds. Single dad sacrifices himself for stranger's child. Neighbors he hadn't spoken to in months left flowers on his porch. A bakery 2 blocks over delivered a box of bread with a card scrawled, "Thank you for showing us what courage looks like." Ethan opened it, bewildered. He hadn't asked for this. All he wanted was to breathe in his own home again. Inside the familiarity of the old couch, the cluttered kitchen counter, the smell of Lucas's socks scattered by the door, it grounded him. But the knock that came minutes later unmoored it all. Caroline stood there, dressed down for once in jeans and a coat. Her daughter Sophie clung to her side, holding a thank you card decorated with crooked stars and shaky marker lines. "Lucas," Caroline said, crouching. "Is it all right if Sophie comes in?" Lucas glanced at Ethan, then nodded. Sophie entered timidly, her small hand offering the card. "For you," she whispered. Ethan accepted it, throat tight. "Thank you for saving me," it read in a child's uneven scrawl. A crude drawing showed a tall figure blocking a knife, a little girl behind him. He forced a smile, brushing Sophie's hair. "You're tougher than most grown-ups I know." She giggled nervously, retreating to sit with Lucas, who immediately began showing her his comic books. Their laughter filled the small living room, bouncing off walls that rarely held joy. Caroline watched them, her face softening before turning to Ethan. "May we talk?" They stepped into the kitchen. The hum of the fridge filled the silence. She set her purse down, eyes sweeping over the cracked linoleum and chipped cabinets. Not judgmental, more observant. "You live like this," she said quietly, "and yet you gave my daughter more safety than the whole city council ever has." Ethan leaned against the counter, weary. "I don't need gratitude, Caroline. I just need normal again." "Normal isn't coming back," she replied. "Your name is on every station. People want to meet you to hear your story. They see you as a hero. I don't want to be anyone's hero. But you are, she pressed. You've forced this city to remember what decency looks like. Her words stung because they carried truth. He rubbed the back of his neck, sighing. What do you want from me? Caroline hesitated, then said, Come to City Hall tomorrow. Just stand with me. If you speak, let it be your words. If not, let them see your face. Because this isn't about politics anymore. It's about showing people courage is alive. Ethan's instinct screamed to refuse. Yet through the doorway, he saw Lucas and Sophie laughing, swapping stories, shoulders pressed together like old friends. Something in him shifted. Perhaps some good could grow from this chaos. Tomorrow, Ethan said finally, but on one condition. Caroline raised an eyebrow. Name it. He folded his arms. No stage speeches, no manipulation, just truth. A slow smile tugged at her lips. Deal. The next morning, the steps of City Hall brimmed with people. Reporters jostled cameras, blinked red. Citizens held handmade signs. Be brave, like Ethan. Protect our kids. Ethan stood stiff in a borrowed suit jacket, Lucas holding his hand tightly. Caroline took the podium, her voice steady, commanding. Yesterday, violence threatened one of our children, she began. But an ordinary man did something extraordinary. He put himself between danger and a little girl who wasn't his. That act reminds us heroism does not come from title or office. It comes from humanity. She stepped aside, nodding to Ethan. He shook his head slightly, but the crowd chanted, urging him forward. Lucas whispered, Dad, it's okay. Just talk like you do to me. So Ethan did. He gripped the wooden edge of the podium, feeling his pulse hammer. I'm no hero, he said, voice rough. I'm just a father. I don't have money or power. But I couldn't stand there and do nothing. None of us should. The crowd hushed, hanging on each word. This city can't be safe if we only look out for our own blood. We have to look out for each other. Because someday it won't be my kid or hers, it might be yours. And if we can't act, then what are we even doing? Applause thundered. Reporters scribbled. Caroline watched him not as a politician, but as a mother, a woman changed. Lucas beamed. Sophie clapped wildly. Ethan stepped back, wishing desperately to disappear. But he knew now he never truly would. That night in his kitchen, Ethan unfolded another letter slipped under his door. I was there when it happened. I froze. You moved. Thank you for reminding me what courage is. He sat in silence, letter trembling in his hands. He hadn't wanted attention, but maybe, just maybe, this was bigger than his comfort. Maybe courage once witnessed spread like fire, and he realized the spotlight wasn't on him. It was on what people could be. Ethan woke the next day with stiffness in his shoulder and a heaviness that wasn't entirely physical. The city had seen his face, heard his words. Overnight, his phone had been flooded with numbers he didn't recognize, messages from strangers, voicemails he had no intention of listening to. Lucas padded into the kitchen barefoot, rubbing his eyes. Dad, everyone at school is talking about you. Some kids said you're like a superhero. Ethan paused halfway through pouring cereal. The words hit harder than any knife. He set the carton down and crouched, meeting his son's gaze. I'm not a superhero, kiddo. I'm just me. You know that. Lucas frowned. But you did save her. I did what I hoped someone would do for you. Ethan rested a hand on Lucas's head. Don't forget, being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means you do the right thing even when you're scared. Lucas nodded, chewing on the thought. The knock on the door came sharp, insistent. When Ethan opened it, Caroline stood there again, this time with no entourage, no cameras. Just her. She held a folder under her arm and an expression caught between determination and vulnerability. May I come in? She asked. Ethan stepped aside, wary. If this is more press, it isn't. She walked past him, placing the folder on the counter. It's an invitation. To dinner. At my home. He blinked, certain he'd misheard. Dinner with me and Sophie. Caroline's tone was steady, but her eyes betrayed nerves. You risked everything for her. She hasn't stopped talking about Lucas since yesterday. I think they could both use something normal, and maybe we could too. Ethan crossed his arms. Why me? Caroline exhaled, gaze dropping for once. Because I owe you more than words. and because Sophie sees you as someone safe. That matters. Ethan wanted to refuse, wanted to retreat into the comfort of anonymity. But Lucas's hopeful glance toward Sophie, who wasn't there but lived in his son's memory, now shifted his answer. What time, he asked. Caroline's home sat perched on a hill, the kind of house Ethan only saw in magazines. Gated drive, manicured lawn, warm light spilling from tall windows. As they approached, Ethan felt the collar of his shirt itch. He hadn't owned a suit in years. Instead, he wore his cleanest button-down sleeves, rolled the fabric stretched taut across his bandaged shoulder. Lucas whispered wide-eyed, "Dad, it's like a castle." Inside, Sophie ran to greet them, pulling Lucas toward a playroom that looked more like a small museum of toys. Their laughter quickly filled the halls, echoing in ways Ethan's house never could. Caroline guided him into the dining room. The table gleamed, set with porcelain plates and silver cutlery that looked untouched by time. A roast filled the air with savory warmth. Ethan sat stiffly, unsure where to rest his hands. Caroline noticed. "Relax," she said with a faint smile. "It's just dinner." He chuckled bitterly. "In my world, dinner is cereal or leftovers. This feels like a board meeting." She laughed genuine this time and poured wine into crystal glasses. "Maybe I need someone to remind me how to eat simply again." The conversation ebbed and flowed awkward at first. She asked about his work, how he balanced being a mechanic and a father. He asked about her campaigns, though politics made him uneasy. Slowly they found common ground, the struggles of raising children alone. "My husband left when Sophie was 4. Caroline admitted quietly, staring at her glass. Said politics consumed me. Maybe he was right. But I stayed. For her. Ethan nodded, a flicker of empathy softening his guard. Mine left when Lucas was barely walking. Haven't heard from her since. Guess we both got abandoned for different reasons." Their eyes met across the table. A silence lingered, not uncomfortable, but heavy with recognition. Two lives different in every measure of wealth, yet tethered by the same scar. Later, while Lucas and Sophie sprawled on the rug with board games, Caroline walked Ethan to the patio. The city lights stretched below, twinkling against the night. "Why did you really do it?" she asked suddenly. "Why step in front of a knife for a girl you didn't know?" Ethan leaned against the railing, staring into the distance. "Because once when I was a kid, no one did it for me. And I swore if I ever got the chance, I wouldn't let another child feel unprotected." Caroline's throat worked as she swallowed. "You carry that with you still. Some scars don't fade." He looked at her, then, eyes steady. "But maybe they can be used for good." She exhaled, her breath clouding in the cool night. "You're not who I expected you to be." Ethan smirked faintly. "Same goes for you, councilwoman." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "Caroline. Just Caroline tonight." Inside, Lucas and Sophie had fallen asleep side by side, a blanket tangled between them. Caroline glanced at the children, then back at Ethan. For the first time in years, her guarded walls cracked just enough to let warmth slip through. Ethan adjusted the blanket over Lucas, brushing hair from his son's forehead. His hand lingered rough and gentle all at once. Caroline watched the gesture, her chest tightening unexpectedly. The city might have seen him as a symbol, but in this quiet room she saw him as something rarer, a man who had nothing and yet gave everything. And she realized she wasn't just grateful, she was moved in a way she hadn't been in a very long time. The drive home was quiet. Lucas leaned against Ethan's arm, half asleep from the night's excitement. Streetlights passed in golden blurs across the windshield, flickering over Ethan's tired face. His shoulder ached, but it was nothing compared to the ache stirring in his chest. Something had shifted that evening, something he couldn't yet name. When they reached the small house, Ethan carried Lucas inside, tucking him gently into bed. The boy murmured something about superheroes, his voice muffled in sleep. Ethan brushed a hand through his hair, whispering, "No, kiddo, just dads." He sat awake in the living room long after staring at Sophie's crayon card, still taped to the fridge. The crooked stars, the shaky handwriting. It all reminded him of a promise he hadn't spoken, but somehow made. To protect. To stand firm. Even if it cost him everything. The following morning broke with the sound of knocking again. Ethan groaned, pulling on a sweatshirt before opening the door. 2 men in suits stood there. Not Caroline, not reporters. Strangers with clipped voices and official badges. Mr. Walker, one asked. Ethan stiffened. Yeah, we're with Councilwoman Whitmore's office. She asked us to escort you to a meeting this afternoon. Sensitive matters. Her request is that you attend. Ethan frowned. I don't need bodyguards. The taller man shook his head. This isn't about protection. It's about a proposal. Against his better judgment, Ethan agreed. By noon, he found himself walking the corridors of City Hall again, the marble floors cold beneath his boots. Caroline met him outside her office, her expression unreadable. Ethan, she greeted, then lowered her voice. Come inside. Please. He followed. Inside, files were spread across a polished table. A chart with headlines, statistics, photos of children crime reports. Caroline gestured for him to sit. This, she began, is what I've been fighting for years. Safer schools, stricter security, better funding. And yet, until what you did, no one cared enough to listen. Ethan rubbed his temples. I'm a mechanic, Caroline, not a politician. You're a father, she countered sharply. And fathers carry a weight politicians can't fake. She pushed a file toward him. I want you to speak at the council hearing next week. Not as an activist, not as my pawn, as yourself. Tell them what happened. Make them see. Ethan pushed the file back. I don't belong in that room. You do, she insisted, leaning forward. Because when you spoke on those steps, people listened. Not to me, not to headlines. To you. His jaw tightened. And what happens after? They clap cheer, and forget the moment the cameras turn off. Caroline's eyes flashed with something personal, almost desperate. Not if we keep reminding them. Not if we make this more than a moment. Help me, Ethan. Help me change something real. The silence stretched. Outside, horns blared faintly in the city streets. Inside, Ethan felt the weight of decision pressing. He wanted anonymity, quiet. But Lucas's face flickered in his mind, and Sophie's card on the fridge. Finally, he exhaled. One hearing. My words. That's it. Caroline's shoulders eased, relief flickering. That's all I ask. That evening, Lucas tugged at Ethan's sleeve. Dad, can Sophie come over again? She said, her mom works too much. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. Maybe soon. Lucas grinned. She's nice, not like the other kids at school who tease me. Ethan crouched, searching his son's eyes. They tease you. Lucas shrugged. Sometimes. 'Cause we don't have much. But Sophie didn't care, she just liked playing. Ethan's throat tightened. Then maybe she's braver than most kids, too. Lucas smiled faintly, then ran off toward his room. Ethan stood there motionless. A realization dawned heavy and undeniable. Their lives were already intertwined threads, woven by circumstance and sacrifice. Whether he liked it or not, Caroline and Sophie were part of their story now. The council hearing arrived sooner than Ethan wished. He stood outside the chamber, Lucas at his side, Caroline nearby speaking quietly with aides. The wooden doors loomed, carved with history. Dad Lucas whispered, Are you scared? Ethan gave a humorless chuckle, terrified. But you're still going in. He crouched, meeting his son's gaze. Remember what I told you? Brave doesn't mean not scared. It means walking in anyway. Lucas nodded, gripping his father's hand tight. Inside the chamber was crowded reporters, officials, citizens, packed into benches. Caroline opened the session, introducing Ethan not with titles, but with 3 simple words, a single father. Ethan stepped up, voice trembling at first. He described the knife, the rush of instinct, the weight of protecting a child not his own. He spoke of Lucas, of the children who deserved a city that didn't fail them. When he finished, the chamber was silent. Not from disinterest, but from impact. And in that silence, Ethan realized something. His voice had power, not because he wanted it, but because it carried truth people couldn't ignore. He stepped down, heart pounding, Caroline's eyes following him. In that moment, he knew nothing would be the same again. The council chamber erupted after Ethan's testimony, not in shouts or clapping, but in a slow-building murmur that spread like fire across the benches. Reporters scrambled to jot down notes, cameras zoomed closer, and even the stiff-faced officials at the long table shifted uneasily in their seats. Ethan, meanwhile, wanted nothing more than to walk out, take Lucas by the hand, and disappear into the quiet of their small house. But he didn't. Not yet. Caroline rose after him, her voice measured but firm. "You've heard his words. Not mine, not any politician's spin. Just a father who saw what could have been another tragedy. If we ignore him, we ignore the thousands of parents who hope their children come home safe every day. We cannot afford to wait until the next headline." The chamber filled with low applause, not orchestrated but genuine. People leaned forward, eyes alive, as if hope had cracked through cynicism for the first time in years. Ethan sat back beside Lucas, who beamed up at him with pride. "You sounded brave," Lucas whispered. Ethan shook his head, squeezing his son's hand. "I sounded scared, but maybe that's what made it real." By the time they exited City Hall, the press swarmed. Flashes blinded him. Microphones thrust forward like weapons. "Mr. Walker, do you plan to run for office? Will you support Councilwoman Whitmore's re-election? What's next for the city's hero dad?" Ethan shielded Lucas with his arm, his patience fraying. "No comment," he muttered, pushing through. Caroline appeared at his side, guiding them toward a waiting car. Once inside, Ethan exhaled heavily. "I didn't sign up for this circus." Caroline's tone was softer than usual. "You signed up for honesty. That's rarer than you think." He turned to her, eyes narrowing. "Tell me the truth, Caroline. Am I just your story? Your ladder to the next office?" Her jaw tightened, but she didn't flinch. "I won't lie. I know what this means for my career. But Ethan, it's more than that. Watching you today, hearing you, it reminded me why I started this work before the politics swallowed it whole. You're not my ladder, you're my reminder." For once, Ethan didn't respond. He just looked out the window as the city rolled by, lights reflecting in the glass like restless stars. That night back home, Ethan laid awake. The air smelled faintly of grease from his jacket tossed on the chair, and Lucas snored gently in the next room. His shoulder ached a dull pulse where the knife had left its mark, but what kept him awake wasn't pain, it was possibility. His phone buzzed again. He ignored it. Another message came. This time he picked it up. The screen glowed with a text from an unknown number. "You think you're a hero. You should have stayed out of it." Ethan froze. Another followed. "Next time you won't walk away." His heart thudded hard. He looked toward Lucas's closed door, fear twisting like a knife in his gut. Whoever had sent the messages wasn't just angry, they were watching. The next morning, Caroline showed up earlier than expected, Sophie in tow. Both children ran off to play while Caroline noticed the tension in Ethan's face. "What happened?" she asked. He handed her the phone. She read the messages, her expression darkening. "Threats. Not the first time in my life," Ethan muttered, "but the first time they've pointed toward my kid." Caroline set the phone down firmly. "You need protection. I don't need—" "Yes, you do," she cut in, voice sharp. "If not for yourself, for Lucas. Let me arrange security." Ethan's fists clenched. "I don't want strangers outside my house. He deserves a normal life." Caroline stepped closer, her voice softening. "Normal isn't safe anymore. Not after this. Please, Ethan. Just until things settle." He wanted to argue, but Sophie's laugh drifted from the living room, blending with Lucas's. Their innocence pierced through his stubbornness. He sighed. "Fine. But just for them. Not me." Caroline nodded, relief breaking through her stern expression. The threats didn't stop. Anonymous letters, phone calls with silence on the other end, cars slowing suspiciously near the house. The police opened an investigation, but answers were slow. Meanwhile, the city buzzed louder. Ethan's testimony spread across news outlets, stirring debates and rallies. Some praised him as the voice of conscience. Others condemned him, accusing him of being a political pawn. One evening, as Lucas and Sophie built a pillow fort in the corner, Ethan sat at the table across from Caroline. The lamplight flickered between them. "This was never supposed to be my life," he said quietly. "I wanted grease under my fingernails, not ink in newspapers." Caroline studied him. "Maybe life chooses us, not the other way around." He scoffed. "Easy for you to say. You've lived in this world your whole career." Her gaze softened. "And you walked into it unarmed and shook it anyway. That's something even I can't do." Their eyes locked, unspoken tension thickening in the quiet. Outside, a car rolled slowly past the house. Ethan noticed first his hand tightening on the table. Caroline followed his gaze, unease flickering across her features. The threats weren't distant anymore. They were circling closer, and both of them knew the fight was only beginning. The following night, Ethan lay awake in the dark, every creak of the old house pulling him from the edge of sleep. The soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the groan of pipes settling, the distant whine of a car engine outside. He found himself gripping the baseball bat he kept by the bed, the same one Lucas had once used in Little League, its handle worn smooth from years of practice. In the next room, Lucas snored gently, the muffled sound of a boy who had no idea of the weight pressing against his father's chest. Ethan knew that if the threats weren't empty, if someone really was watching, then the little bubble of safety he'd worked so hard to build could shatter in an instant. The next morning, Caroline arrived unannounced. Her SUV pulled into the cracked driveway, black against the faded paint of Ethan's modest home. She stepped out dressed not in her usual tailored suit, but in jeans and a sweater almost unrecognizable without her polished armor. Sophie trailed behind her, clutching a backpack. "Is Lucas ready?" she asked brightly. Ethan blinked. "For what?" Caroline smiled faintly. "For school. I thought maybe I could drive them both today." Ethan studied her carefully. There was something softer in her demeanor, but also something deliberate. He opened the door wider. "He's inside finishing his homework." As the kids darted down the hallway, Caroline lingered at the threshold. "How are you holding up?" Ethan gave a humorless laugh. "Haven't slept much. Every car that drives by feels like a warning." Her expression darkened. "The investigation's ongoing, but I pulled some strings. The threats aren't just crank messages, they're tied to someone with a record. Violent, unpredictable. Which means you and Lucas aren't safe." Ethan's jaw tightened. "So what do you suggest?" "Hide in a bunker." "I suggest," she replied carefully, "that you consider staying somewhere more secure. With me." The words hit harder than expected. Ethan stared at her, suspicion warring with an odd sense of relief. "You're offering your house?" "Yes, my security detail is already in place. Sophie and Lucas would be safer." "You would too." Ethan shook his head. "That's not me. I don't belong in mansions with guards at the door." Caroline stepped closer, her eyes steady. "This isn't about belonging, Ethan. It's about survival." Later that afternoon, Ethan agreed not for himself but for Lucas. Packing up felt strange. He shoved clothes into a duffel bag, tucked Lucas's sketchbooks under his arm, and glanced around the small house that had been their whole world. The peeling wallpaper, the patched-up couch, the tiny kitchen that always smelled faintly of oil and toast. It was their home, imperfect, but theirs. Leaving it even temporarily felt like surrendering a part of himself. Lucas, however, was thrilled. "Dad, Sophie says her house has a movie room. And a pool." Ethan smiled faintly, ruffling his son's hair. "Don't get used to it. This is just a stopover." "Okay?" Lucas nodded, but his excitement didn't dim. When they arrived at Caroline's estate, the contrast was jarring. Gates slid open with mechanical precision, guards nodded at their arrival, and the driveway stretched wide enough to host a parade. Ethan stepped out duffel slung over his shoulder, feeling like a stranger trespassing in a world he'd never asked for. Caroline led them inside. Sophie rushed to show Lucas the rooms, their laughter echoing through high ceilings. Caroline turned to Ethan. "You'll stay in the guest wing. It's private. No one can get near you without clearance." Ethan dropped his bag on the polished floor, shaking his head. "This place feels like a hotel." Caroline's lips curved faintly. "Then think of yourself as an unwilling guest." Despite himself, Ethan chuckled. The sound startled him. It had been days since he'd truly laughed. That night, as the children fell asleep upstairs, Ethan stood on the patio, staring out over the sprawling city lights below. Caroline joined him, holding 2 mugs of coffee. She handed him one, the steam curling between them. "You look restless," she said softly. "I don't belong here," he admitted. "This world, it's not mine. Lucas and I were simple. We fix cars, eat cereal, scrape by. This house, these walls, it's another planet." Caroline leaned against the railing. "Maybe, but right now it's also a fortress. Don't confuse luxury with protection. Sometimes they overlap." Ethan sipped the bitterness, grounding him. "And when this is over, when the threats stop, when the cameras turn away." "What? Then?" Caroline hesitated, her voice quiet. Then you go back to your life, and I go back to mine. But maybe not unchanged. Their eyes met in the dim light, something unspoken passing between them. The peace didn't last. 2 nights later, while the children built a blanket fort in the den, a loud bang echoed from the gate. Ethan sprang to his feet, instinct sharp. He grabbed the baseball bat he'd brought from home, heart pounding. Caroline's security rushed to the entrance radios, crackling. From the window, Ethan saw its spray-painted words across the front gate in crude red letters. Traitor. Heroes die first. Lucas and Sophie froze, eyes wide. Caroline hurried them away, her face pale but composed. Ethan gripped the bat tighter, his muscles coiled with fury. They're not just watching anymore, he growled. They're coming closer. Caroline's hand touched his arm, steadying him. And we'll face it, together. For the first time, Ethan believed her. But deep down, he also knew this battle was no longer just about him or her career. It was about survival, about proving that ordinary people, when cornered, could stand as tall as giants. And that truth carried more danger than any knife ever could. The spray-painted gate was scrubbed clean by morning, but the echo of the words still clung like smoke in Ethan's mind. He sat at the breakfast table with a mug of black coffee, staring at the wood grain as if answers were hidden in the lines. Lucas and Sophie munched cereal at the other end, blissfully occupied with who could build the tallest tower out of Cheerios. Caroline entered dressed in crisp navy, the steel in her eyes softened by fatigue. They're escalating, Ethan muttered without looking up. She didn't disagree. Security doubled overnight. No one's coming through those gates. Gates won't stop hate. Ethan replied, voice low. Won't stop someone determined enough. Caroline paused, then set her hand gently on the table between them. Neither will running. Their eyes met the air thick with unspoken tension. Ethan wanted to believe her resolve was enough, but he knew shadows didn't care about walls. Later that day, he tried to distract himself by helping Lucas and Sophie in the garden. The estate's grounds stretched wide, filled with trimmed hedges and blooming roses. Ethan knelt in the dirt, his calloused hands clumsy against the delicate plants. Lucas laughed. Dad, you're worse than me, Ethan smirked, flicking a bit of soil at his son. Sophie squealed and joined in, soon turning the garden into a playful battlefield of mud. For a brief moment, laughter drowned out fear. From the patio, Caroline watched, arms crossed, a wistful smile tugging at her lips. Ethan noticed her gaze but didn't comment. He just let the children's joy shield them all for a little longer. That evening, as the house quieted, Ethan stepped into the study. Books lined the walls, heavy tomes of law and policy, but one shelf caught his eye, photo albums. Curiosity tugged at him. He pulled one down and flipped it open. Caroline as a teenager, hair wild, grinning on a hiking trail. Caroline in college, standing on courthouse steps, fist raised in protest. Caroline with Sophie as a baby, exhausted but radiant. Her life laid bare in glossy snapshots. Not the polished politician, just a woman. You found the past. Her voice came from the doorway. Ethan nearly closed the album, but her tone stopped him. He looked up. Didn't mean to snoop. Caroline stepped inside, her shoulders easing. You weren't snooping. You were reminding yourself I'm human. He studied her carefully. You don't seem like someone who lets herself be human much. Her smile was tired. Not in this job, but you? She hesitated. You strip away the armor whether I like it or not. The silence between them deepened, heavy but not suffocating. The peace shattered hours later. A security guard's radio burst alive with frantic chatter. Ethan rushed downstairs, bat already in hand, heart hammering. Caroline followed close behind. Perimeter breach, one guard barked, sprinting past. From the window, Ethan saw dark figures scaling the fence before spotlights blinded them. Guards swarmed, shouts cutting the night. One intruder hurled a bottle that burst in flames against the driveway, Molotov fire roaring. Ethan shoved Caroline behind him instinctively. Get the kids! She hesitated, torn, but one look at his face sent her flying upstairs. Ethan gripped the bat tighter, stepping outside the heat of fire washing over him. Shadows moved against the glare, retreating as sirens wailed in the distance. Police arrived fast, but the damage was done. The illusion of safety cracked wide open. After the driveway reeked of smoke and ash, Guards hosed down blackened pavement. Lucas clung to Ethan's waist, trembling. Sophie buried her face against her mother's shoulder. Caroline looked shaken, though she tried to hide it. "They're not afraid anymore," Ethan said, voice grim. "They're desperate." Caroline met his eyes, steel hardening again. "Then so are we." She straightened, pulling her daughter close. "Tomorrow we go public. No more shadows, no more whispers. If they want to scare us into silence, we'll speak louder." Ethan stared at her, torn between admiration and fear. "And if it makes them angrier?" Her reply was quiet but firm. "Then let them see we're not bending." In that moment, Ethan understood. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was theirs. And though his body still carried the scar of the knife, his soul knew the truth. He hadn't been wounded to retreat. He'd been marked to stand. The morning after the fire, the house was too quiet. The char on the driveway had been pressure-washed to a pale gray smear, but the smell of smoke still threaded the air like a warning that wouldn't let go. Ethan stood at the kitchen counter, hands wrapped around a mug gone lukewarm, and listened to the hush that follows danger, the kind that makes you tiptoe, as if sound alone might shatter the thin dome of safety. Caroline moved with efficient, calm fielding calls, answering questions from her security chief, nodding at updates only she could translate. But when Lucas and Sophie wandered in hair-mussed eyes still swollen from sleep, she softened, crouching to their level. "We're okay," she told them, voice steady, hands warm on their shoulders. "We're together. We're safe." Lucas looked up at Ethan for confirmation. Ethan nodded even as the night replayed in flashes, bottle-bursting fire licking the air, guard sprinting his hands white-knuckled around a bat he hadn't used since Little League. Caroline finished a call and set her phone face down so it wouldn't keep buzzing. "Press conference at City Hall noon," she said, not asking, just stating. "No more shadows, no more letting someone else write our story." Ethan's jaw worked. "You're sure?" Her eyes held his. "I'm sure." He set the mug down. It clicked against the counter like a small decision made. "Then I'm with you." Sophie leaned into Lucas, whispering something that made him smile despite everything. The small, ordinary thing of children sharing a secret tugged a loose stitch in Ethan's chest and tied it tighter. He felt the answer to a question he hadn't wanted to ask himself: why keep going? Because they were watching. Because they were learning how to stand. On the drive downtown, rain beaded on the SUV's windshield, gathering, racing, gone. Ethan watched the water trace the glass and thought of the night at Roosevelt Middle, how fear had narrowed the world to a single knife, a small girl, a bus bearing down, and one choice. Fear still narrowed things. But now the edges were wider. A city, a law, a house with scrubbed stone and blackened memory telling them to hush. At City Hall, the steps swarmed, cameras, microphones, citizens in ball caps and suits and scrubs and paint-streaked overalls, all pressed together by curiosity and something that looked suspiciously like hope. Security made a corridor. Caroline walked first, chin lifted a faint sheen at the corner of her eyes that didn't break. Ethan followed, shoulders squared the line of his scar, just visible where his collar wouldn't cover it. They took the podium together. Caroline didn't clear her throat or wait for silence to fall. She made it. Last night, she began, voice even, someone tried to frighten a family into hiding. They painted threats on a gate. They set fire to a driveway. They wanted to burn courage down. She let the words sit. Rain clicked softly on microphones. But courage doesn't burn. It multiplies. She turned slightly, not to gesture to Ethan, but to stand with him the way you acknowledge a person, not as prop, but as partner. This man isn't a headline. He's a father. And he's going to speak for himself. Ethan stepped forward. The hum pulse of the crowd swelled, then softened. He could hear a bus exhale at the curb below, the sea sound of umbrellas, the breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "I don't have a speech," he said. "I have a son." A chuckle rippled. A few people nodded as if they knew that single fact contained a life. "I'm not here to be brave on a microphone," he continued, voice rough but steady. "I was terrified last night. I'm terrified now. But I won't teach my kid that fear gets the last word. I won't teach your kids that either." He lifted the edge of the podium, not to lean, but to feel wood under his fingers. Someone spray-painted our gate. Someone lit our driveway on fire. But the smoke cleared, and we're still here. The answer to terror is not hiding, it's each other. It's showing up. It's telling the truth over and over until lies get tired. A reporter shot his hand up, voice sharp. Mr. Reyes, isn't this reckless? Aren't you inviting more danger by grandstanding? The crowd bristled. Ethan didn't. He turned toward the voice without heat. I invited danger the minute I stepped out of my car to help a child. We all invite danger when we choose each other over our own comfort. That's not grandstanding. That's living in a city with other people in it. Another voice, gentler, called from the crowd. I was there that night, said a woman in a nurse's jacket, hair pulled back. I treated you in the ER. You told your boy he was safe while you were still bleeding. I wanted to tell you he believed you. Ethan felt the ground tilt in that small, quiet way grief and gratitude do. He nodded to her. Thank you. Caroline returned to the mic, kept it brief. We will not be intimidated. We will not reward fear. We will pass protections for anyone who risks themselves to help another. And we will stand with families who need more than applause. That's the work. That's the promise. They didn't take questions. Not many. The story wasn't for debate today. It was a line drawn. At school that afternoon, the rain let up long enough for kids to rocket out into the playground at lunch. Lucas and Sophie sat on the low wall by the basketball court sharing half a PB&J like a treaty. A few boys from the 7th grade court drifted too close, jostling loud. One of them, a name Lucas knew only by the weight of it. Cole smirked. Hey, hero, Cole said, towing Lucas's sneaker. Your dad light the fire so he'd get more TV time. Sophie slid off the wall before Lucas did, even though her hands were trembling. Back off, Cole snorted. Or what your mom's gonna make a law at me. Lucas stood, not 3 inches taller than his fear, but enough. He felt the urge to shove to meet loud with loud. He heard Ethan instead. Brave means doing the right thing when you're scared. You don't have to like my dad. Lucas said, voice steady because he made it be. But you don't get to lie about him. Cole stared. The air held. Kids edged closer the way they do when they can smell a story turning. A 6th grader with braces, tiny fierce, stepped up beside Lucas. Leave him alone, she said, chin jutting, or deal with all of us. 2 more slid into place, not a mob, a line. Cole laughed half-hearted, now shoved his hands into his hoodie and mumbled something about a game on the far court. He wandered away. The moment didn't explode. It unspooled. Something small, unremarked, anchored instead. Sophie blew out a breath. My hands were shaking. Lucas looked down at his own. They were too. He smiled despite it. Same. They sat again. The PB&J treaty survived. That evening, back at the house that wasn't theirs, but had become their shelter, the doorbell chimed and a thin man in a soaked UPS jacket held out a battered envelope. No return address. No postmark. Security opened it gloved like it was fragile. Inside a Polaroid of the burned driveway and a single typed line. Next time we don't miss. Caroline's jaw went hard. Ethan's blood went cold, then hot. He expected panic. What came was clarity. The fire had been loud. This was colder, smaller. The kind of threat cowards send when they want a response they can measure. She pressed the intercom for the security office, gave instructions in a voice that didn't shake. When she turned back, the rest of her face had caught up with her eyes. Fury. Yes, but something softer wrapped around it. Protectiveness so strong it steadied him. You can move back to your house, Caroline said, almost daring him to argue. Or you can stay until we end this. Ethan tried on his old reflex, we don't belong. We won't take charity. We'll make do, and found it didn't fit anymore. Not because pride had disappeared, because the definition of we had changed. We stay, he said. We finish what we started. The kids played Mario Kart in the den, laughter spiking, drowning out the nervous system's hum. Ethan and Caroline took the patio same as the night after the Raleigh City lights, salt and sugar across the dark. She broke the quiet first. You keep choosing into this even when you could walk. He shrugged, not dismissing the compliment so much as turning it to look at it. So do you. I have a platform, she said. You have a scar. She looked at him for a long beat. Both are reasons. Yours feels heavier. Ethan leaned on the railing. Scars are just receipts. Proof we paid for something worth keeping. She laughed short, surprised, and it cleared a space in the night. What did you buy? He glanced through the glass at Lucas and Sophie, faces lit by a TV glow and immunity that only kids can manufacture minutes after fear. Time, he said. For them? For other people's kids? For a city to remember it's a city. They stood like that shoulder to shoulder, not touching, not needing to. The rain returned in a sifting mist, settling on the patio table in tiny constellations. Caroline didn't go in. Ethan didn't either. They were either both stubborn or both hopeful. Maybe both. Her phone buzzed. She didn't pick it up. "We take tomorrow to the neighborhoods," she said, as if planning a grocery run. "Community centers, church, basements, union halls. Not cameras. People. We build something that can't be burned." Ethan nodded. "You talk policy. I'll talk receipts." He could feel the day in his bones. The press conference, the playground, the Polaroid, and none of it dimmed the thing that mattered most, the line they'd drawn together and the quiet chorus gathering behind it. Inside, Mario Kart declared a victor with a bright ta-da. Sophie whooped. Lucas groaned. Ordinary joy returned like a stray cat claimed the warm spots on the couch and pretended it had always lived there. Ethan turned from the city to the window, to his son, to the friend who had knocked on a hospital door and refused to stop knocking on whatever came next. Fear hadn't vanished. It had simply been asked to share the room with other tenants, purpose, stubbornness, a kind of love that didn't require naming. He breathed. The scar tugged. The rain sang its small silver song. Tomorrow waited. He didn't feel ready. He felt willing. Sometimes that was more than enough. The following morning broke brighter than anyone expected. The rain had scrubbed the city clean, leaving the streets slick and gleaming like fresh paint. Ethan stood on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching steam curl from it in the cool air. He could hear Lucas inside asking Sophie if she wanted to trade the last of the cereal for a half slice of toast. Ordinary sounds, but they landed heavy. After the Polaroid, nothing ordinary could be taken for granted. Caroline arrived from the other side of the house, dressed down jeans, a windbreaker, sneakers that looked brand new but carried a deliberate simplicity. She nodded toward the waiting SUV. "Ready." Ethan lowered the cup. Ready. He wasn't sure he was not for what they had planned, but he also knew waiting for readiness was another way of saying no. Their first stop was a church basement on the south side. The building was old brick, rain stained the steps uneven. Inside, folding chairs were arranged in rows. A dozen people had gathered, an older man with calloused hands, a mother with 2 kids playing in the aisle, a young woman in scrubs who'd clearly come straight from a night shift. Caroline stood at the front, but not behind a podium. She sat on a folding chair like everyone else, hands on her knees, voice steady. "I didn't bring a speech," she said. "I brought a question. How do we build a city that protects people who do the right thing?" The room was quiet. People glanced at each other. Ethan could feel the skepticism thick in the air. They'd heard promises before. Finally, the older man spoke. "Lady laws don't stop fire, or knives, or hate." Caroline didn't flinch. "You're right. Laws can't stop hate, but laws can say which side we stand on when hate shows up, and that matters." The young woman in scrubs lifted her head. "I was in the ER when he came in." She nodded toward Ethan. "He was bleeding, and he kept saying, 'Tell my son he's okay.' That's the kind of person this city ought to protect." A ripple of recognition moved through the room. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, but didn't argue. The mother with the kids asked softly, "So what happens when someone like him gets targeted? Do we just wait for the next fire?" Caroline shook her head. "No, we create a network of support, legal aid, rapid response, community watch. And we back it up with policy so nobody who stands up is left standing alone." Ethan finally spoke, his voice quieter than he expected, but carrying anyway. "We don't need heroes. We need neighbors who know each other. If I'd known more faces that night outside the school, maybe it wouldn't have just been me." That landed. Heads nodded. The young woman in scrubs whispered, "Amen." By afternoon, they'd spoken in 3 neighborhoods, each one different in tone, but the same in need. In a union hall, a man with grease still on his hands said he'd seen too many coworkers punished for speaking up about safety. In a community center, an immigrant father asked if reporting harassment meant risking deportation. Caroline didn't dodge. She promised to push for protections that included everyone. Ethan watched her as she answered firm, compassionate, never promising what she couldn't deliver. He realized something he hadn't said aloud. She wasn't just fighting for him or his son. She was fighting because she believed the city could be better. Late in the day, they stopped at a small park where a group of teens were gathered near the basketball court. No official meeting here, just kids curious about the cars, about the woman they'd seen on TV, about the man with the scar. One boy, maybe 16, called out, "Yo, you? The dude who got stabbed for that girl." Ethan froze. Caroline gave him a small nod, telling him silently to own it. "Yeah," Ethan said. The boy squinted, leaning on his bike. "Why'd you do it?" "She wasn't your kid." Ethan thought about lying about some noble phrase that would play better. Instead, he said the truth. "Because she was somebody's kid, and I hope if it was my boy, someone else would do the same." The boy stared, then looked down. "My little sister walks home from school alone." Ethan stepped closer. "Then walk with her." The boy blinked. He hadn't expected the challenge, but after a moment he nodded. "Yeah. Okay." That evening, as dusk settled purple over the city, Ethan and Caroline returned to the house. The kids ran out to meet them, Lucas tugging Ethan's sleeve, Sophie showing Caroline a drawing she'd made of two stick figures holding hands in front of a house with no fire. Caroline knelt to admire it, her smile soft, but her eyes tight with something unspoken. She hugged Sophie briefly, then looked up at Ethan. "They're the reason this matters." He nodded. The drawing burned into him deeper than any scar. Dinner was quiet laughter weaving through cautious silences. Afterward, when the kids were asleep, Ethan stepped onto the porch. Caroline joined him, arms folded, staring out at the city lights. "You know what scares me the most?" she said. Ethan glanced at her. "What?" "That we're not just fighting people with spray paint or gasoline. We're fighting people who believe fear is stronger than hope." Ethan considered that. "Maybe they're right. Fear's easy. Hope's hard." She turned to him, her face in shadow, but her voice clear. "Then we prove them wrong." The night held its breath. A siren wailed in the distance. Somewhere a bus hissed to a stop. And in the small silence between, Ethan felt something settle inside him. Not certainty, not safety, but resolve. Resolve that when the next fire came and they'd be ready. Inside, Lucas stirred in his sleep, murmuring something about finishing a race in Mario Kart. Sophie rolled over, clutching the drawing of the safe house like a shield. The world outside was dangerous, messy, cruel. But in that house, for one night, hope held. And sometimes Ethan thought that was how revolutions began. Not with banners or speeches, but with a small girl drawing a house unburned. The storm wasn't over. It was only changing shape. The following week, the city seemed to live in two different realities. On one side, the newspapers ran Caroline's words alongside photos of Ethan standing near her, a reluctant figure whose scar peeked from beneath his collar like punctuation. On the other, the same papers carried editorials calling her reckless, accusing her of exploiting tragedy. The tension was palpable. Ethan felt it in the stares at the grocery store. A woman in line whispered too loudly, "That's him," while her husband shushed her. A cashier offered to bag his groceries, voice trembling with something between respect and fear. He came home unsettled, the bags cutting into his fingers, wondering if he'd become a symbol when all he wanted was to remain a man. Caroline, however, walked into the fire daily. She spoke at town halls, shook hands on sidewalks, and met with council members behind closed doors. She never once suggested Ethan step aside, though she knew the weight was crushing him. That night she found him in the garage tinkering with the car. Grease streaked his hands, though the engine didn't really need fixing. "You don't have to be in front of this," she said gently. He didn't look up. "And what I'd protect your kids?" "Protect yourself." Ethan tightened a bolt harder than necessary. "I didn't take that knife just to disappear afterward." Her eyes softened. "I know, but it's not your burden to carry alone." He wiped his hands, finally meeting her gaze. "It stopped being just mine the second your daughter looked me in the eye." Something shifted in her, then a flicker of vulnerability she quickly masked. Days later, the backlash came harder. Flyers were stapled to telephone poles, crude caricatures of Caroline with words like traitor scrawled underneath. Ethan ripped one down on his way home, his stomach sick. That night, as he tucked Lucas into bed, His son whispered, "Dad, are we the bad guys?" Ethan froze. "Why would you say that? Some kids at school said you're on TV because you did something wrong." He swallowed, forcing his voice steady. "I did something right, buddy. Not everyone likes that, but right and wrong aren't decided by the loudest voices." Lucas's brow furrowed, but he nodded, pressing closer into his father's side. Ethan kissed his head silently, promising that no lie would ever define their truth. 2 nights later, a brick shattered their living room window. The sound was violent glass raining across the floor. Sophie screamed. Lucas bolted from his room. Ethan grabbed the bat before his mind even caught up. By the time he reached the yard, the car speeding away was just taillights. On the lawn lay the brick wrapped in paper scrawled with one word, "Leave." Caroline appeared beside him barefoot, the kids clinging to her legs. Her hands trembled as she picked up the brick. She didn't say anything, just met his eyes. In that moment, there was no politician, no symbol, just a mother afraid for her child. Ethan put a hand on her shoulder. "They want us scared, but fear is their weapon, not ours." Her voice cracked. "And what if it works? Then we fight harder." The police filed another report, promised more patrols. But promises didn't seal windows. Ethan spent hours boarding up the glass. His reflection fractured in the shards he swept away. As he worked, Caroline returned from tucking the children back into bed. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. He didn't need to ask what. "Taking the knife." "Yes." He hammered a nail, the sound sharp. Then he looked at her. "Every time I feel my son's arms around me, and never once when I remember the girl's scream." Tears pricked her eyes, but she blinked them away. "You confuse me, Ethan." He smirked tiredly. "Join the club." The next morning, Caroline made a bold move. She scheduled a press conference not in a government hall, but on the very school steps where the attack had happened. Ethan stood at her side, the scar visible now, no collar to hide it. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted. Caroline raised her hand, commanding silence. "Fear visited this place," she said, her voice ringing. "But we're still here, and so long as we stand together, fear doesn't win." She turned slightly, gesturing toward Ethan. This man didn't wait for backup. He didn't look for permission. He acted because a child was in danger. That's the spirit we need in our city, not to tear each other down, but to lift each other up. Ethan shifted uncomfortably under the attention, but when the crowd erupted in applause, he felt something stir. Not pride, not ego. Something steadier. Hope. That night, after the cameras were gone, after the last guard's flashlight swept across the yard, Ethan sat on the porch alone. Caroline joined him quietly, a blanket draped across her shoulders. "You didn't want the spotlight," she said softly. He shrugged. "Doesn't mean I can't stand in it for a while." Her smile was small but real. "Thank you." He sipped his coffee, staring at the scarred horizon of the city. "Don't thank me. Just make sure it means something." She nodded. "I intend to." And for the first time, Ethan believed she might. By dawn, the house had settled into a kind of brave quiet, the kind that follows a storm because everyone decides to keep breathing anyway. Ethan woke before the kids padded barefoot to the kitchen and found the note Caroline had left on the counter in her fast, decisive handwriting, City Hall, 9 a.m., final vote expected. "I'll meet you there." He set the note aside and whisked batter in a mixing bowl, the cheap metal whisk scraping the glass with a sound that was somehow comforting. Lucas wandered in, hair wild, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Pancakes?" "Pancakes," Ethan confirmed. "That's how we fight back." Sophie trailed after blanket draped over her shoulders like a cape. She sniffed the air, then grinned. "Can bravery taste like maple syrup?" "It better," Ethan said, flipping the first pancake. "Or we're doing it wrong." They ate at the island legs, bumping security radios, murmuring faintly from down the hall. When the plates were cleared, the children raced upstairs to brush their teeth, their footsteps thudding in the rhythm of a normal morning that had to be chosen and chosen again. Caroline came in just as Ethan was rinsing the bowl. She wore slate gray hair pulled back, a small nick on her thumb that she'd taped herself. She took in the empty plates, the lingering warmth, and her shoulders eased. "We ready?" "As we'll ever be," Ethan said, drying his hands on a dish towel that smelled faintly of lemon soap and smoke. City Hall was already full by 8:30. The chamber doors gaped like a mouth, swallowing everyone at once. Reporters, nurses on late shifts, bus drivers, teachers, a squad of teenage volunteers in matching shirts that said "Bravery Chain." Someone had taped a construction paper banner over a balcony rail, "Protect the helpers." Ethan didn't want to see himself as one of those. He couldn't stop himself. They took their seats near the front. Lucas and Sophie sat between them, dressed too nicely because children try to dress their hope when adults won't. Ethan could feel the heat of the room, the static hum of bodies pressed together, the way air changes when a decision is near. The council president banged the gavel and the agenda droned, and then Caroline stood. She didn't look at the cameras, she looked at the people who had squeezed into folding chairs and onto the floor and into hallways because they recognized their own reflection in this. This act, she said, hands loose at her sides, is a promise that when you step forward for a stranger, you won't be punished for it. It is not permission to be reckless. It is protection for being human. She didn't mention the fire or the brick or the Polaroid. She didn't need to. The room held those things like a shared scar. Opponents had their turn. A councilman with a practiced frown warned about vigilantism, about budget strain, about unintended consequences. A lobbyist in a perfect suit called it performative compassion. A blogger in the press row typed virtue theater without looking up. Ethan felt his jaw set. He thought of a kitchen knife slick with rain and a girl's breath hot against his palm while he told her to run. He thought of Lucas's small hand pressed at his ribs, crying, "Don't close your eyes." Public comment opened. People lined up at a microphone that looked too small for what it had to carry. A bus driver spoke first, middle-aged cap in hand. "I was the driver who hit the brakes that night," he said, voice trembling. "I go to work every day afraid of the moment I can't stop in time. I need a city that doesn't put all the weight on a single father's back." A nurse in her scrub's hair, still damp from a quick shower, told the room about swabbing a wound while a man kept asking if his son was okay. A janitor spoke about losing wages after breaking his wrist stopping a hallway fight. No one had helped with the bills. A seventh grader, brace-faced brave, said, "My friends and me started a kindness club. Don't make us explain to new kids that kindness is a liability." When it was over, the council filed out to deliberate. The room loosened into chatter, then prayer, then the anxious silence of a waiting room. Ethan felt the urge to flee. He stood instead, stepped into the corridor, and called the number he'd been avoiding. Peterson's auto came the familiar growl. "Hey, boss." Ethan stared at the polished marble at his distorted reflection in it. "It's me." "You in the news again?" Peterson said, a mix of gruff pride and complaint. "You gonna make people think I pay hero wages?" Ethan almost laughed. It came out like air leaving a punctured tire. "There's a vote today. If it passes, Caroline Councilwoman Whitmore wants me to help build some things. Outreach. Support. I don't know what to call it." Peterson was quiet longer than expected. "You thinking of leaving? I don't know." He swallowed. "I know engines. I don't know City Hall." "You know broken," Peterson said, "and how to fix it without making it worse. That's more than most of them. Do what you gotta do. Your bae will miss you." "I'll manage." "Thank you," Ethan said, because it was all he had. Back in the chamber, the council trickled in faces like weather. Ethan sat. Lucas reached for his hand without looking. Caroline stared straight ahead, lips pressed together, Sophie's shoulder against her arm like ballast. The council president read the tally. Numbers lined up too slow for a beating heart. Ayes. Nays. The motion carries. The room didn't erupt. It sighed, then rose into applause that wasn't triumphant so much as relieved, like a lung filling after a long hold. Caroline closed her eyes for a single second, then opened them and turned to him first before she did anything else. He didn't realize he'd been standing until he felt his knees. He didn't realize he'd been crying until Lucas tugged his sleeve and wiped at his father's face with the corner of a Bravery Chain flyer. "You did it," Lucas whispered. "We did," Ethan said, and it felt true and big enough to hold everyone in that room. They slipped out a back corridor to avoid the crush of microphones. In a small office that smelled like paper and coffee, Caroline shut the door and leaned against it. For once, she looked tired in a way she would allow someone else to see. "This is the part where I ask you something outrageous," she said, not even pretending to ease into it. Ethan exhaled a laugh. You've asked me to do nothing but outrageous lately. Then one more. She stepped to the desk, laid a folder down between them. A city seal gleamed on the cover. I want you to help build the first rapid support network. Real people answering real calls. Legal triage. Emergency grants. A standing team that gets activated when someone steps into danger or when someone is left bleeding after doing the right thing. He stared at the folder like it might bite. Caroline, I know, you're a mechanic, you don't speak policy. You don't belong in rooms where the water pitchers sweat and everyone uses leverage like it's a verb. Her mouth twitched. I don't need a policy person. I have too many. I need a person. I need you. His chest tightened, not with fear this time, but with the weight of being seen too clearly. My kid comes first, she said. Always. The job understands that, or the job goes away. He looked down at his scar as if it could answer. It didn't. But he remembered a garden of mud-splattered children, a church basement folding chair, a boy at a basketball court saying he'd walk his little sister home. He remembered the Polaroid and the brick and the gate washed clean. He remembered pancakes. I'll try, he said. I can't promise I'll be good at it. I can promise I'll be honest. Caroline's shoulders dropped like a rope cut loose. She grinned, quick, unguarded, shockingly young for a second. That's the entire job description. Ethan told Lucas that night on the drive home, the city sliding by in blurs of neon and wet concrete. I might be working with Ms. Witt with Caroline, helping people like us, he said, stumbling because he hadn't practiced. Lucas's eyes went wide. Like a superhero's assistant. More like a mechanic who carries a phone, Ethan said. But yeah, kind of. Lucas nodded, solemn as a judge, and you'll be good at that. You already are. At the house they're still small. They celebrated with root beers and greasy takeout in paper bags. Lucas made a sign on notebook paper. Go, Dad, fix the city. Ethan taped it to the fridge right beside Sophie's crayon drawing of 2 stick figures and a house without flames. The edges of both curled where steam from pasta nights had softened the tape. He left them curling. It made them look like they'd been here a while. The first week was a tangle of phone calls, missteps, and small wins that felt like lifting a car an inch with a jack. Nothing dramatic, but everything possible because of it. Ethan sat in a bare room with donated desks and mismatched chairs and took calls from people who sounded like echoes. A grandmother whose son had been injured breaking up a fight and couldn't afford the ER bill. He connected her to the fund's first disbursement and listened while she cried relief into the receiver. A school custodian worried he'd be fired for intervening in a hallway brawl. Ethan looped in a pro bono lawyer who knew exactly which paragraph in the new ordinance kept him safe. A teenager shaking as she described stepping between a bully and a boy with an inhaler, Ethan told her he was proud of her and then asked her to hold while he got her principal on the line to formalize a peer support club. Between calls, he paced the scuffed tile, learning the map of his own doubt. He messed up too, transferred someone to the wrong office, fumbled an intake form and had to call back to ask a name he should have written the first time. He wrote breathe on a post-it and stuck it to the monitor. He wrote listen on the desk with a permanent marker and decided if anyone complained, he'd say it was policy. Peterson stopped by one afternoon in his oil-stained jacket, surveyed the room like he was checking an engine. Looks like work, he grunted. That's how you know it's worth it. Ethan laughed. I miss the smell of brake fluid sometimes. Peterson clapped his shoulder, a careful fatherly thump. Go make the city smell better instead. At school, Lucas and Sophie turned their 2-person kindness club into a dozen and then 2 dozen. They filled a cardboard box with mittens and granola bars. They sat with the kid who sat alone. They asked teachers if they could present a 5-minute bravery minute at assemblies. The principal said no at first, then relented when the counselor pointed to the drop in hallway referrals. One night, Lucas spread poster board across the living room floor. We need a logo, he announced. Something simple, like a hand. Sophie tilted her head. A hand's good, but maybe 2 hands. They traced cut glued. When they held up the finished sign, Ethan's chest did that breaking healing thing it had learned to do so often lately. 2 hands messy with glue overlapping like a promise. Caroline arrived late, hair damp from rain, the day's exhaustion pulling at the corners of her mouth. She saw the hands and smiled, something inside her unspooling. That's it, she said softly. That's the whole platform. Ethan found her on the porch after the kids drifted to bed the city, a sequined blanket across the dark. "I don't know if I can do this forever," he admitted. "Some days I hear the knife again. Some days I still want to hide." "Me too," she said. "Not about the knife, about the hiding." They stood quiet a while. The porch light hummed. Down the block a dog barked twice, decided against a third time. "You know what I think," Caroline said at last. "Scars don't ask you to be fearless. They ask you to be faithful." Ethan rubbed at the line under his collar. It tugged, then settled. "Faithful. I can try." He looked through the window at the fridge, Lucas's sign, Sophie's drawing, both rippling slightly in the heater's breath. The house was still small. The world was still large. Tomorrow would be another day of phones and meetings, and someone needing help at the same moment the coffee went cold. He closed his eyes, opened them, stepped back inside. Work had begun. The following weeks blurred into something strange, an odd mix of chaos and routine, as if the city itself had decided to test whether Ethan was serious. Every morning began the same alarm at 6:15, the smell of cheap coffee percolating Lucas and Sophie, scrambling for backpacks and mismatched socks. The rapid support network, still more dream than structure, waited for him downtown in that half-furnished room with crooked blinds and desks that wobbled if you leaned too hard. Yet before he left the house, he always stopped at the fridge, touched the edge of Lucas's "Joe Dad Fix the City" sign and Sophie's drawing of the unburned house. It was his armor. By 8, he was at the phones. By 9, the stories began pouring in. A grocery clerk fired for intervening when a customer shoved a woman. A college student who'd shielded a stranger during a protest and now faced suspension. A father who lost 2 days' wages after breaking up a fight in his building's stairwell. Ethan wrote every name on yellow legal pads, his handwriting tightening when the stories got heavier. Sometimes he pressed his palm flat against the desk to steady himself. Each time he remembered the night of the knife, the way fear doesn't announce itself politely, it just lunges. Caroline stopped by often, not to command, but to listen. She'd perch on the edge of a desk, shoes, kicked-off jacket, folded across her lap. She looked less like a politician there, more like the woman who had once wept in his doorway with her daughter safe in her arms. "How are you holding up?" she asked one afternoon, her voice quieter than the hum of the fluorescent lights. Ethan hesitated. He wasn't used to answering honestly. "Some calls stick. They don't end when I hang up. I keep hearing them." "That means you're the right one for this," she said simply. "The wrong people don't hear at all." The network began to grow. A young lawyer named Priya volunteered 3 nights a week, her laptop always plastered with protest stickers. A retired nurse brought in cookies for the team and handled medical triage calls with brisk compassion. 2 high schoolers set up a social media page, and suddenly, strangers across the city were messaging, "I saw something. I stepped in." Now, what Caroline used her influence to funnel small grants their way, but it wasn't enough. Ethan stretched every dollar like he used to stretch a paycheck for rent and groceries. Still, each time he signed off on a bus fare reimbursement, each time he sent a grocery voucher to a man who'd missed work because of a sprained wrist, he felt a quiet victory. Then came the night the phones didn't stop ringing. It was a Thursday. Rain lashed against the windows, thunder rolling in long, low growls. A fight had broken out at a late-night rally downtown, and volunteers were scattered trying to de-escalate. By 10, Ethan was fielding overlapping calls. An injured teacher, a boy with a head gash, a mother terrified her son would be arrested for defending a stranger. His hands cramped from writing. His throat went raw from talking. Caroline rushed in from City Hall, hair dripping, dropping her briefcase on the floor. "Divide the board," she ordered. "You take medical. I'll take legal." For hours they worked side by side, passing notes, coordinating rides, pressing phones against shoulders while scribbling addresses. When the last call finally died close to 2 a.m., Ethan leaned back in his chair, exhausted. Caroline sat across from him, damp sleeves rolled circles under her eyes, deep as bruises. And she laughed. "Why are you laughing?" he asked, incredulous. "Because it worked," she said, breathless. "Because we didn't break." He stared at her, then felt the smallest tug at his own mouth. A laugh escaped him, too dry, cracked, but real. For the first time in weeks, the weight on his chest eased. Not everyone was pleased. The morning after headlines screamed city funds funneled into Hero Hotline, and is this compassion or chaos? Talk show hosts scoffed at a mechanic running social work, and pundits called it Whitmore's vanity project. Ethan clipped none of it. He had no room in his head for people who never stood in a street with someone bleeding. But Lucas did. The boy saw one of the broadcasts at a neighbor's house and asked his dad that night, voice trembling, "Are they going to shut you down?" Ethan knelt, hand steady on his son's shoulder. "They can yell. We'll keep answering the phone. That's how you know it matters when people try to scare you away from it." Lucas nodded slowly, like someone learning a rule that was older than he was. Weeks passed and the network hardened into something sturdy. The volunteers formed a rhythm, the intake forms piled in neat stacks, and the fridge in the office filled with mismatched leftovers from families who wanted to say thank you. Yet Ethan knew they were walking a razor's edge. The system could topple with one scandal, one mistake, and one mistake was coming. It happened on a Sunday morning. A teenager called sobbing. Her brother had been arrested after defending her from two older boys who cornered her outside a store. Ethan promised they'd help, but the police report painted it differently, claimed her brother had been the aggressor. The media pounced, spinning it into a story of the network encouraging vigilantism. By Monday, reporters swarmed the office shouting questions through the blinds. Caroline ordered extra security. Volunteers whispered about resigning. Priya, the lawyer, slammed a folder down on the desk and said, "If this is how they're going to fight us, we need to fight back with proof." Proof meant witnesses. Proof meant dragging quiet people into loud rooms. Proof meant danger. That night alone in the office, Ethan stared at the yellow pads stacked high with names, people who had trusted him with their pain. He thought of the knife, the blood, the way survival is always messy and never polite. He whispered to the empty room, "What if I ruin this for them?" From the doorway, Caroline's voice answered steady, as if she'd been waiting. "Then you get up the next day and fix it. That's what you do, isn't it?" He turned. She stood there, hair pulled back, eyes fierce with something he couldn't call politics anymore. "You fix what breaks." Ethan looked down at his scar, then at the folder Priya had left. He realized the fight wasn't about a single case, or even the ordinance. It was about whether a city could admit that broken people still mattered. He closed the folder, stood, and said quietly, "Then let's fix this, too." The hearing room smelled faintly of dust and old wood polish, the kind of place where history liked to pretend it never moved. Rows of benches were filled with reporters, officials, and curious citizens who wanted a glimpse of the fight. At the front, Ethan sat stiffly at the witness table, his scar visible beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. Beside him, Priya shuffled through folders, whispering reminders, while Caroline leaned in her chair with that calm political steel in her posture. The case against the Rapid Support Network was clear in its accusations they were inciting vigilantism, operating without oversight, interfering with law enforcement. The city's legal counsel spoke like a man rehearsing lines in front of a mirror, each phrase clipped and clean. But Ethan knew the real trial wasn't in the documents, it was in the faces of the people behind him. He could feel their weight pressing forward, the grocery clerk, the college student, the father from the stairwell. They'd shown up filling the benches with ordinary clothes, nervous hands, and hopeful eyes. Priya rose first, presenting witness after witness. A teacher with stitches along her scalp, voice trembling as she described strangers holding her until the ambulance arrived. A mother clutching her son's photo, saying the network gave her a ride home when no one else would. Caroline watched, face unreadable, but Ethan caught the way her hand twitched on the table as if holding herself from clapping. Then it was his turn. The oath felt heavy, the Bible cold beneath his palm. He sat, cleared his throat, and the room stilled. "I didn't plan for any of this," he began. His voice sounded rougher than he expected. "I was just a dad walking home. And when I saw a knife pointed at a girl, I didn't think about ordinances or headlines. I thought about my own daughter. And I moved." Silence followed, deep and thick. He went on. "Afterward, people started calling, not because I'm special, but because no one else was picking up the phone. They weren't looking for a hero. They were looking for someone who wouldn't hang up on them." The city's lawyer pounced. "So you admit you created an unauthorized organization dispensing aid without regulation? That's dangerous." Ethan met his gaze steady. What's dangerous is a world where people are too scared to help each other. The audience stirred murmurs, spreading like wind through grass. Caroline's lips curved almost imperceptibly. By midday, the hearing broke for recess. Outside on the courthouse steps, cameras swarmed. Reporters shoved microphones toward Ethan. Questions flew like arrows. Do you regret it? Is this about politics? Are you and Caroline Whitmore working together beyond this case? Ethan raised a hand, the crowd instantly falling into a hush. He hadn't earned, but somehow carried. I'm not here for politics, he said firmly. I'm here because fear is loud. But courage doesn't have to be quiet. And if you're asking whether I regret standing in front of a knife, the answer is no. Not then. Not now. The clip spread across the evening news like fire. For once, the headlines didn't twist his words, they carried them intact. But the fight wasn't over. The opposition doubled down, releasing edited footage of network volunteers breaking up scuffles painted to look like brawls. Ethan felt the ground shift again. Doubt crept in. Would the truth always be slower than lies? One evening, he drove home later than usual, headlights cutting through drizzle. At his porch, he found Caroline waiting. She was wrapped in a navy coat, hands shoved in pockets, eyes shadowed. You shouldn't be here, he said, stepping out of the rain. Neither should you, she shot back softly. But here we are. They stood in silence, listening to rain drip from the gutters. Then she said, You've carried this farther than anyone asked you to. Ethan shook his head. No, I carried it as far as it had to go. For the first time, she looked tired, not the polished kind of fatigue she showed at press conferences, but the bone-deep exhaustion of a mother of a woman who'd fought too many battles and was still bracing for more. My daughter sleeps because of you, she whispered. Don't think I'll ever forget that. His throat tightened. He wanted to tell her that he wasn't the savior she imagined, that he still woke up at night hearing the blade slice air. Instead, he only nodded. The final day of the hearing arrived like a storm breaking. The chamber was packed the air electric. The board announced their decision the network would remain, but under provisional oversight with city partnership. Not a full victory, but not defeat. Ethan exhaled, shoulders slumping, while Caroline squeezed his hand under the table, brief and unseen. As the room erupted in mixed shouts, some cheers, some protests, Ethan glanced at the crowd. He spotted Lucas and Sophie in the back, wide-eyed but proud. He spotted the girl he'd saved clutching her mother's hand. He spotted ordinary people who looked at him not as a headline but as proof. He realized then this wasn't about surviving a knife anymore. It was about what came after. And what came after was just beginning. That night the porch light glowed as Caroline walked him to his door. She lingered hesitant. So what now? Ethan looked out across the dark street where rain still glistened on pavement like broken glass. Now he said quietly, We build something that lasts longer than fear. She smiled faintly, her eyes soft in the glow. Then let's not waste time. And as the door shut behind him, Ethan knew part 17 of his story wasn't an ending at all, just another step toward a city learning how to stand together. They didn't throw a parade when the network survived the hearing. There were no floats, no banners, no jubilant marches. That wasn't the shape of this victory. It moved quieter than that, like grass through cracks, like light under a door, like a promise kept. Months turned, then years. The Rapid Support Network traded its wobbly desks for steady ones, its borrowed phones for a real dispatch system, its shoestring funding for a modest line item with a public dashboard anyone could read. The city learned the number by heart. Parents scribbled it on fridge magnets. Teachers taped it to their desks. Crossing guards carried the card in their breast pockets right next to prayers. And in the steadier light of a gentler spring, there was a Saturday when the four of them, Ethan and Lucas, Caroline, and Sophie, walked up the steps of Roosevelt Middle School together. The rain had taken the day off. The building wore fresh paint, the kind that made old bricks look new, without lying about their history. A small crowd waited near the entrance, teachers, neighbors, kids with phone cameras, a brass quartet from the high school warming a tune no one could quite place. Beside the front doors, a sheet covered a plaque bolted to the wall. The edges of the bronze peeked through like a secret trying to breathe. Caroline squeezed Sophie's shoulder and went to greet the principal. Lucas bumped his elbow against his father's, a quiet, conspiratorial nudge. You sure about this? He asked. Ethan tugged at his cuff where the scar sometimes tugged back. Not even a little, he said, and managed a smile that felt like stepping onto a stage. but maybe we don't have to be. They gathered close. The principal said a few words about memory, about beginnings, about how sometimes the worst day becomes the seed of a better city if you water it with stubbornness. Then she looked to Ethan. Would you do the honor? He nodded. The cloth felt rough in his hands. He pulled it down. The bronze gleamed. The inscription was simple, to the ordinary courage that saved a child and taught a city to stand together. Beneath it a smaller line, let it never be rare. No cameras flashed at first. The quiet was too thick. People stood with their hands in their pockets, as if a hat should be held. Sophie took a half step closer to Lucas, a reflex older than language. Ethan swallowed the pebble in his throat and traced the letters with his eyes, not touching the way you look at something holy from one breath away. Caroline spoke last. She didn't use the voice she saved for press conferences. She spoke like a woman at a kitchen table. This plaque isn't a monument, she said. It's a reminder. That day wasn't about politics or headlines or careers. It was about a father, a stranger to us all, putting his body between fear and a child because he couldn't do otherwise. The rest of us have been catching up ever since. She turned to Ethan. Didn't perform the looking, simply met him steady. Thank you for giving us something worthy to chase. Ethan felt heat prick behind his eyes and let it be. The quartet found the melody they'd been searching for and offered it gently to the wind. People clapped the way they do in church, soft, grateful not for the speaker, but for the hope that doesn't embarrass them anymore. When it was over, they drifted in small knots across the steps. A boy about 13, lanky, a skateboard under his arm, approached Ethan with a shyness that had grit in it. Sir, he said, my sister called your number last month. After some guys followed her from the bus, a lady from your office stayed on the line till she got home. Ethan felt that tug again, lower this time deep. She get home okay? Yes, sir. The boy nodded, eyes shining like he'd swallowed a star. Thank you. Don't thank me, Ethan said, and the words came easier than they used to. Thank the neighbor who met her halfway. I did, the boy said. But I wanted to tell you too. They shared a small, careful smile, two strangers who knew each other anyway. Across the steps, Lucas and Sophie had found the brass quartet's empty case and were tossing in crumpled bills from their pockets, giggling like conspirators caught by kindness. Caroline lifted a brow as if to scold, then folded instead, laughter rolling out of her like relief. Come on, she said, a few minutes later, tapping her watch. If we don't leave now, the parking lot will trap us until Tuesday. They walked to the car. People waved. A woman with a stroller handed Ethan a muffin wrapped in a napkin, the kind of small-town gesture that didn't used to happen in a city this size. He thanked her and tucked it into his jacket, the weight of it absurd and perfect. As they drove, Seattle slid past the windows, cherry trees shaking off blossoms like confetti. Bus stops with hand-lettered flyers for block potlucks, teenagers in matching Bravery chain t-shirts painting over graffiti on a low wall, while someone's abuela brought out lemonade. Ethan watched it all and thought for the 100th time how odd it was to love a place that had once tried to chew him up and float on. He loved it anyway, maybe because of that. At the house, their house, now a modest blue with a porch that insisted on wobbling no matter how often he tightened the screws, Ethan carried grocery bags inside, while the kids argued about whether pancakes counted as dinner if you added bacon. Caroline unlocked the door with the confidence of someone who had learned which key sticked and how to coax it. The living room held its familiar collage, scuffed coffee table couch with a repaired seam, a pair of backpacks defying gravity on a hook. On the fridge, the paper sign Lucas made years ago, Go Dad. Fix the City had faded to a softer red. Beside it, Sophie's drawing of the house without flames had been joined by newer artifacts. A program from the network's second-year fundraiser, a Bravery chain postcard with two messy overlapping handprints, a Polaroid of the four of them squinting into late summer light, unposed, caught mid-laugh. Ethan set the bags down and pulled out a carton of eggs. Lucas slid onto a stool, pencil in hand math worksheet, waiting like a dare. Dad, he said without looking up, Ms. Keene says if I want to volunteer at the community center this summer, I have to keep my grades up. That's a fair bargain, Ethan said, cracking an egg one-handed, the old shop dexterity repurposed. What's the problem? Lucas tapped an equation. Slope. I get the idea. The line goes up or down depending, but the numbers keep slipping. Numbers do that, Ethan said. He drew a small graph on the back of the paper, pressed the pencil at one point and then another. All slope is change over distance. How far you went up or down for how far you move forward. That's it. Lucas frowned, then nodded. So, it's a way to measure how hard something's climbing. Ethan smiled. Exactly. Sophie appeared hair in a messy bun, pretending not to hover. Can I help? Always, Ethan said, and watched her slide onto the other stool, their shoulders knocking and then settling into a shared angle. Caroline leaned at the counter opposite, chin in her hand, eyes soft in a way that made him want to look away and keep looking at the same time. The news murmured low from the corner television, more habit than hunger. The anchor's voice was almost bored with good news, as if the city had gone and misplaced some of its old drama. Violent incidents down another 7%. Community intervention program expands. Good Samaritan claims cap raised. The words washed through the kitchen like warm water over cold hands. After dinner, bacon-approved pancakes devoured. Caroline walked out to the porch with 2 mugs, steam ribboning into evening air. The light slipped toward amber. A dog barked once, then decided the world could survive without its input. Across the street, a boy on a bike slowed to help a toddler's shoelace. His mother raised her chin in thanks, a small salute between strangers who weren't not anymore. Caroline tucked a leg under herself on the step. Do you ever regret it? She asked, and the question had aged with them, worn smoother but not thinner. The first night. The knife. Everything it cost. Ethan thought of the knife the way he always did, 2 cold flashes, a slice of air, a child's hand as small as a bird in his. He thought of hospital bleach and a teacher sitting through the dark of a city that could have shrugged and instead chose to kneel down and put its hands out. He thought of threats and hearings and long nights with cold coffee and phones that didn't stop. He thought of pancakes as a weapon of a sign taped to a fridge of an unburned house. No, he said, finally. I regret that it had to start that way. But not the choice. Caroline nodded something like relief, loosening her shoulders. Me neither. Lucas pushed open the screen door with his hip paper in hand. Dad, look, he said, breathless. I got the slope right. Ethan took the page, studied the line climbing across the tiny grid. Change over distance, hard things measured. Looks right to me. Lucas beamed. Sophie leaned over his shoulder, proud, like she had solved it too by proximity. In a way she had. The porch light flickered on. Moths found it with unerring faith in what shines. Inside the sink filled with plates, the table held the geography of a shared meal, and the fridge hummed like a contented animal. Ethan felt the old ache in his shoulder, the honest tug of a story you don't get to leave behind. He lifted his mug. Caroline lifted hers. The kids leaned against the doorframe mirror images without meaning to be. Tomorrow, Caroline asked. Tomorrow, Ethan said. He meant the meetings, the calls, the small repairs you make in a city before breakfast so the day has a chance. He meant the network's calendar full of names and the blank spaces that would fill with new ones. He meant that the plaque on the school wall would oxidize but not fade. He meant that when fear showed up, because it would find a crowd waiting. He meant we keep choosing each other. Rain returned the way it does here, quietly, like a promise. It tapped the porch roof, glossed the street, made the city's lights look softened and near. The 4 of them sat there listening, and the listening felt like prayer, no words, just a willingness to be held in the sound of something constant. The knife had written the first line, but it wasn't the author. They were. All of them. The city, too. And the story, ordinary, stubborn, warm as kitchen light, kept going. One small act at a time. One neighbor at a time. One ordinary, extraordinary day at a time. Your thoughts will help us create meaningful stories. And if you want to hear more powerful healing stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the bell icon so you don't miss any new episodes. And most importantly, share this video with someone who needs a little hope today. Thank you so much for your time. We hear you, and we are honored to tell these stories for you.